So, hopefully this is recording. I did not get the video from last Thursday put up because I left for New Mexico right after class with my brother and my dad to go hunting on Elk Mountain. It was the opening day or opening weekend for grouse. We didn't see any grouse this year. We don't seem to see very many grouse ever. I don't know whether they're sort of elusive birds, but so I will get that put up just as quickly as I can. I apologize for not having it put up. It helps me not only helps you, but it helps me remember where we left off. If my memory, which it's failing because I'm getting older, is correct, I believe that we got finished with talking about republic, which is the sort of first fully worked out philosophical theory that's complete, that answers all of these three questions: the question of conduct, the question of knowledge, and the question of governance. What is it we can know? How can we know it? We get in Republic the idea, just sort of a recap, the idea of the philosopher kings. There's somebody that sees things clearly. That's what we can know. Most of us don't know a lot, according to Socrates. We're constantly being deceived. And I can give you lots of examples of that, where we think we know something and it turns out not to be so. One of the best examples that I have is I'm a commercial pilot. That was what I wanted to be more than anything else in the whole wide world. I started taking flying lessons when I was 10 years old. I soloed when I was 16. I got my private pilot's license when I was 17, which is on my birthday, which is the minimum age requirement to be a private pilot. I got my commercial pilot's license and my instrument rating on my 18th birthday, and I wanted to be an airline transport pilot. I graduated from high school in 1992, and I use this as an example of how we tell students a mythology in this country, which is you can be whatever you want to be. And we look at people like Barack Obama and we say, well, if he can make it to the presidency, you can too. And the truth of the matter is, no, you really can't. Not everybody can be president. We've got 250 million plus people in the United States. Not everyone is going to make it to be president. Hillary Clinton was probably the most qualified person. Whether you agreed with her or not, she was by far the most qualified person to have ever run for the presidency in terms of having known what it was like, because her husband had been president, she had been a United States Senator and a Secretary of State, and as much as she wanted to be president, and she really, really wanted it, that wasn't going to happen for her at this point in time. And I wanted to be an airline transport pilot, and that was not going to happen for me, because in 1992, Bill Clinton won the presidency, the Cold War ended, and the military was downsizing. The way you became an airline transport pilot historically is, in order to build jet hours, heavy jet hours, you went into the Air Force and you flew transports, and then you got out of the Air Force after you learned how to fly transport planes, and you had all of these hours and C-130s and things like that, and you got into American Airlines or Delta or United or Southwest. I was not going to be able to do that because the military was not taking new pilot slots the year that I graduated from high school and went into college, and so I had to go become a lawyer instead. The reason I give you that background is one of the things that I noticed as a young pilot is that there are certain sensations that you feel in a plane. And for those of you who have flown, and I take it everybody in here has flown. Anybody not flown? You've not actually flown on a plane. Okay, I had one student like 3 years ago, he'd never been on a plane. His first trip as a sales student to Great North Woods was his first time on an airplane. You oftentimes experience what's called turbulence, particularly low-level turbulence, when you're taking off and landing. And the sensation that you get, if you've experienced this, for those of you that have flown, is you get a sensation of falling. But low-level turbulence is actually caused by differentials in heat and air mass close to the ground, and you're actually being thrown up. But the sensation is one of falling. So we're deceived all of the time. And Socrates says, well, it's the philosopher who really understands this realm of the forms and sees things clearly. And so he has these three questions answered. The one that students and I started talking about this last time liked the most the business students particularly, is the teleological or utilitarian theory of ethics. This can be traced, you can find ethos of teleological ethics in Aristotle. So just as Socrates had a famous student who was Plato, Plato had a famous student who was Aristotle, and Aristotle is very complimentary of his teachers, of Plato and his predecessor Socrates, but he does look at things differently. He was a physician by training, a biologist, and so he looked at things from an empirical standpoint. Republic is a thought experiment. Aristotle looks at things from a scientific standpoint, and so you can find ethos of teleological all the way back to Aristotle, although we'll talk more about his ethics in terms of virtue, which is what he's most famous for. But the greatest writers here are probably Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And what is utilitarianism? Well, it's predicated on our economic system. Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations comes up with this idea of the efficient market hypothesis. And we started talking about that last time. If I pay for this phone, I'll put it to the best use. I'm using this phone for a lot of things. Somebody who's 85 years old and only wants to talk to their grandchildren doesn't need this much of a phone. I'm using it to control the camera. So I'm willing to pay more for this phone, and Apple is releasing their new iPhone soon, right? What was the big iPhone that came out? They released 3 iPhones at once the last time they did a release. They released the 8, the 8 Plus, and the X, or the 10. They're going to release their new versions of the iPhone, and we'll have to see how different it is from the previous versions of the iPhone.
I think they're coming up, I think it's like the same base as the 10, they're just making one that's gold. I know that's one of the different ones.
Yeah, they're just, I mean, at this point, really, it's incremental changes. There's
Yeah.
not that much difference. And one of the first comedians I remember doing a sort of a spoof on Apple went out when I think it was the iPhone 6 came out. I think that's right. And he was showing people, he was basically taking the previous model, which was the iPhone 5, and taking it out and saying, here's the new iPhone. And people were like, oh yeah, that's much better than the old one. And then it was like, guess what? That's the 5, actually. So we've gone through various models, but you know, I'm willing to pay more for this phone than maybe somebody who's 80 and just wants, you know, maybe they don't even need to talk to their grandkids because their grandkids live close, but what they need is they need to be able to dial 911 if they've fallen and they can't get up. And that, you know, they don't need all of the power that this phone has. And so the idea is that if I'm willing to pay for it, these private goods, I will put to the best use that I'm able to, because I'm willing to pay more for it than somebody else. In ethical terms, what this leads to is not the maximization of utility, which is what economists talk about. And maximization of utility, I tell students, is really a fancy word. If you want to get a worthless degree, absolutely worthless, get a degree in economics. All they do is rename things that we all understand intuitively with fancy terms. So economists talk about the maximization of utility. What does that mean? Well, it really means you want to get the most bang for your buck. You want to stretch that dollar as far as you can. You want to make every purchase that you've got count. Now, there are problems with this theory, I will tell you that. There's a lot of problems with it, and that people are not always rational. Large parts of economics are predicated on what we might call the rational actor theory. And it's not always, we're not always rational actors. But in terms of ethics, what we're going to do is not maximize the dollar, and we're not going to stretch that dollar. We want to maximize happiness. So it's called the greatest happiness principle, or in the negative, the least amount of pain principle. So we're going to maximize happiness. Utilitarian ethics takes 2 forms. The original form and then a modified form which attempts to deal with some of the problems that the original form has. So I told you last time that these are valid ethical theories. The invalid theories are subjectivism, cultural relativism, and psychological egoism. And those are invalid because they fail on three critical elements of what makes a valid theory, in that they are emotive, they're not based on logic, and therefore they allow for exceptionalism. And if we allow that, we can't form really good societies, because we start saying, well, there's this exception to the rule, and this person is special, and they're exempt from the rules. You might think of this as, I hate to be overly political, but Donald Trump, he's now telling Jeff Sessions that he needs to stop investigating Republicans, like Duncan Hunter, who used all of his campaign contributions to do things like buy an $800 plane ticket for a rabbit so that it could go to Washington, D.C. with his kids. Took a little trip to Europe. And I would submit to you that you might not want to be married to Duncan Hunter, because his defense for all of this is, I didn't do it, my wife did it.
Yeah.
She handled all the finances. Isn't that great? I'm guessing that marriage is not long in this world. But, Donald Trump started saying, no, don't investigate Republicans. They're special. They're unique. Well, that's not really going to work in a society that wants to be predicated on the rule of law. And so this allowing for exceptionalism is a major problem with those three theories. Now, the valid ethical theories, on the other hand, are all based on logic. They're non-emotive because they're based on logic, so the first two are related, and they allow for no exceptionalism. But that's not to say that they don't have problems. So the oldest form of utilitarianism is what we call act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. Now, what act utilitarianism says, and Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in his book Utility, or Utilitarianism, says that what we need to do is we need to analyze every situation and act in such a way as to promote the most amount of happiness. Now, the reason that this is not allowing for exceptionalism is it's not the most amount of happiness for you. You are somebody that should be taken into consideration, but you cannot simply act to promote the greatest amount of happiness for yourself or your family. You have to think about what? The aggregate. You have to think about the aggregate. Now, what might be wrong with this idea of thinking about? So, as I teach you all, what I need to do is I need to constantly be taking in information and responding to you in an ethical way, according to this, that maximizes overall happiness. Well, what is that? You all have paid good money to come here and learn something. So, much as I would have liked to have stayed on Elk Mountain and continued to hunt grouse, because work sucks, I came back. I drove 500 miles back from New Mexico yesterday just so that I could be here with you all and your bright and shining faces. Isn't that ethical? Rather than calling in and saying, I'm sick. Actually, I couldn't call because there was no service on Elk Mountain. It's one of those dead zones. So I guess I could have, gotten a carrier pigeon to fly down to the general store in Torero and send out a message that I'm not here. Grouse. Doesn't grouse. I've hunted grouse for 30 years. I've seen maybe 10.
You know.
They look kind of like a pheasant.
Do you use dogs?
Without, huh?
Do you already hunt them with dogs?
You can. We don't have a dog right now. Because of the altitude and stuff, it's not really all that helpful to get a dog. They'll be in the trees a lot of times this time of year. They're really unusual birds. They're one of the few birds that actually goes, as the weather gets worse, they go up in elevation. And they will actually, to stay warm in the winter, they'll like fly in snowbanks and bury themselves in the snow.
Very solid.
They're a very unique bird. So, didn't see any grouse this year. which was actually fine with me because I really don't like to, I would probably be a vegetarian on moral grounds because I don't really like to kill anything, but then I get hungry and, but my family are all avid hunters, so I go along, to keep peace. No, they're not. If you can hunt them, they're not, in the United States, they're not endangered. This is not Africa.
That's why I was wondering, I was like, if you never see them, then maybe are they like, shouldn't be hunted, or?
They're just hard to find. And it's, particularly since I was born and raised in New Mexico until I was in the 7th grade, and then we moved to Guthrie. Because you start out at 11,000 feet, it's slow going. You have to adjust to the climate up there, and the breathing is a little bit
What part of New
difficult.
Mexico is that? Is that?
It's the Santa Fe National Forest,
Okay.
right above Santa Fe.
Yeah, I was in Colorado this weekend, went hiking, it was so winded.
A little winded, yeah. I used to love it when I was a kid. Every year I would go to this summer camp called Brush Ranch, which is just below where we had our cabin. And all of the kids that went to Brush Ranch, for the most part, were not from New Mexico. They were from Texas and Oklahoma. And it was great because I played tennis and I could beat the crap out of them because they would be winded because they weren't used to the altitude at 9,000 feet.
I climbed
So-
a really peak, and I climbed a mountain in Colorado, and it's like, it was higher, but for some reason it was so much harder in New Mexico.
Everybody will experience some amount of altitude sickness at about 9,000 feet.
I think the top of that was like 13 something.
Wheeler?
But, yeah, Wheeler, and it just affected me differently. And then we planned it a month ahead of time, and we were just hoping the weather would cooperate. And a week beforehand, there was a chance of storms, and we're at the top, and then like a thunderstorm rolled in, and all the girls here was like standing up straight, and they're like, we gotta go.
Yeah,
And so
you need a lot of static electricity because of it's so dry up there, and then when you get some rain. Anyway, so I came back. All of this is to say I came back because I wanted to maximize utility. It wasn't my happiness that I was worried about. I would have stayed up there for another 2 weeks, but I need to come down and give you all, impart my knowledge to you. And that seems okay, right? That's fairly straightforward. But let's get more complicated than that. How do you maximize happiness with regard to, let's say, this product? Anything wrong with marketing this product, the iPhone? Or is it just all sweetness and light?
It slows down after they issue the new upgrades and new phones. And
My battery's going dead because this one's old. It's like 2 years old now, and it's going, so I'm gonna have to replace either the phone. And Apple makes it more difficult to replace the batteries than other phones do. Is that ethical? It's called planned obsolescence, isn't it? It encourages you to do what? Every 2 years, go out. Yeah, they cannibalize their own products. And is that ethical?
Yeah, where do you have an iPhone?
I don't know. What do you, how many of you?
They probably just have a big ass garbage bin, just all this.
How many of you have sold your old iPhones? I've still got like tons of, I've got a whole
I think,
drawer
yeah,
full
there
of
is
old
some
cell
nice
phones.
Yeah, I usually give mine like back to Verizon, they give me a discount on the new one that I'm getting.
Aren't they like, because like, it has precious metals in it technically.
Usually, they're called rare earth metals, by the way. And they're actually not that precious and they're not that rare, it turns out. But usually you can get more money selling it on your own than you can by trading it in. These are actually worth quite a bit of money if you get the new iPhone. So I've thought about doing that, but then I get lazy and I just throw it in the drawer somewhere, keep it, have the new phone.
You could probably sell all of them to buy the new one.
Well, let's think about how we're going to measure this happiness that's created by this device. There are studies that suggest now, one of the things that I have to do is I have to teach differently today than was prevalent or the predominant methodology of teaching when I went to college. When I became a college professor, I was 22 years old, and one of my older colleagues, whose name was Dr. Jones, I started out, by the way, not as a marketing professor, I started out as a political scientist here at UCO, across the parking lot in Hippy Dippy over there. teaching things like American national government, state and local government, problems of democracy, and then when I got my bachelor's and master's and started teaching at 22. Then I got my Juris Doctorate and I started teaching law courses. But as a very young professor, I remember one of my colleagues coming to me and he said, Professor Aguirre, at the time I wasn't Dr. Aguirre, I just had the master's degree. He said, I'm going to give you one solid piece of advice. I said, what's that, Dr. Jones? And he said, you can always tell whether or not you have a good class or a bad class within the first minute and a half of class. And I said, how's that, Dr. Jones? And he said, you walk in, you stand up on the first day, and you say, good morning, class. And if it's a bad class, they will respond with, good morning, Dr. Jones. And I said, how do you tell if it's a good class? He said, there will be silence and they will write it down.
Have you ever had a good class?
No. By those standards, I have never had a good class. But I tell you this because the way that people used to teach was they stood up there, and back in the day they used transparencies. If you didn't, I longed for the days of chalkboards. I loved chalkboards. I just loved them. Loved chalkboards. Which you'd write on the chalkboard, or you'd get a transparency. You'd make these things, you'd type up your notes, and you'd put them onto transparencies, which were then projected by an overhead projector. How many of you actually remember these devices? You can't see them anymore. They're hard to
Well,
find.
we lived in Oklahoma, it was a poor school, so they didn't have
So they still had
We
transparencies.
had some classes,
Yeah.
If you go over to the history department, there are still professors that have been there for 40 years that are teaching the same thing, and they're still using. And if you teach things like, the Civil War, we know how that turned out. I often think that I would like to be a history professor because I could come up with one set of notes and never have to change it. Because we know how that ended. And so I think that's nice. Whereas marketing I have to teach radically differently because it changes constantly. When I started teaching marketing, when I finally became a marketer, I couldn't have controlled a camera with my phone. I can't stand up here and just lecture to you and expect you to get it. And one of the reasons, and the reason I'm telling you all this, that I'm going through this litany is that this device, we think it creates happiness. And what it's done, studies show that we have actually created an entire generation that has, as a result of environmental factors, has ADD and ADHD. Because we respond in enormously short sound bites to things. Situational comedies, things change almost every 3 minutes. And why is that? Because that's your attention span. Now, as a result of things like this device, it's programmed us to have very, very short abilities to focus. We should put everybody on Ritalin to get you to be able to focus. And so you think, well, we brought this device to market, and how are you going to measure this happiness? A lot of people cannot get through college. College is not a test of intelligence, people. College is a test of endurance. You don't have to be smart to get through college. You just have to be able to sit down and shut the hell up long enough and regurgitate what people tell you back on exams to get a college degree. And a lot of people can't do it. They just can't. They can't put the device down. Hell, I can't put the device down long enough. I'm teaching, and I'm jonesing to touch the device constantly. How do you measure that happiness? And then there are just some things that we would say, yeah, no, don't do that. Even though you can create happiness in the aggregate, there's just some things that's creepy. Don't do it. CNN did a thing called How Ethical is the Chocolate in Your Easter Basket? We're coming up on the second largest chocolate selling day in the United States. The biggest selling day of chocolate worldwide is actually Easter. But the second biggest day in the United States is Halloween. How many of you know that slave labor is largely used to produce the chocolate that you eat? How do you know? You can enslave so CNN in their Eatocracy did this special on the slave trade of chocolate on the west coast of Africa. And they went and they interviewed like this kid who's working in the cocoa fields. And he didn't even know what he was producing it for. He'd never had chocolate. You can enslave a small number of people to produce chocolate, and isn't it great? We're all happier. We know that when you eat the chocolate, what happens? It sends off the same chemical reactions. There's a release of hormones from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary that starts firing these neurons in your brain that make you happy. You eat the chocolate. It's the same thing that happens when you take the drink, if you smoke the joint. You know, all of these are similar processes that happen. And in spite of the fact that you could say, well, we've increased overall happiness, most of us would say, that's creepy. And so now you can figure out whether or not your chocolate is ethically sourced. You can look for things like Utz Good Inside on the label, and it will tell you whether or not the chocolate was brought in from South America where they don't have slave labor. Not that it's great labor, but it's not slave labor that's being used to produce the chocolate. You can look for Rainforest Alliance. These kinds of certifications that it is ethically traded. And so a second form emerges, because that's creepy. If you can enslave a small number of people to create overall happiness, we just say that's creepy. Don't do it. So a second form, let's take a more extreme form of utilitarianism. Let's suppose that a police officer knows with absolute certainty the identity of a serial killer. But the evidence against the serial killer is completely, this is called the hypothetical of the serial killer. The evidence against the serial killer is all circumstantial. He knows that if he actually arrests him and takes him to trial, he's not likely to be convicted, because the standard in trial is that you have to be guilty beyond a what?
Reasonable doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a heavy bar. That's a heavy bar. Let's think about this. There was a huge amount of evidence against Paul Manafort in this case. Mountains and mountains of evidence. And there was still one juror that held out on 10 counts in the Paul Manafort trial. It's a heavy bar that the prosecution has to meet. So there's all this circumstantial evidence against the serial killer. He's not likely to be brought to justice. So the police officer has watched the movie Judge Dredd. They've made a remake of Judge Dredd, the original one. Anybody seen the original Judge Dredd movie? Anybody seen the remake? Okay, so Judge Dredd, the original movie, I believe it was it Sylvester Stallone that played Judge Dredd? It's a dystopian movie set in the future. And in the future, the police are judge, jury, and executioner. They see somebody committing a crime, they tell the citizen to stop, and if they determine that they've committed the crime right then and there, they smoke them. Justice is quick. Well, our police officers watched Judge Dredd, or the remake recently, the original with Sylvester Stallone, or the remake, and he's decided that rather than taking this guy in, putting him on trial where he's likely to not be convicted, I'll just take him out. We'll save resources. Trials are expensive. Lawyers cost money. So we'll just smoke the guy. Well, most of us would say, yeah, that's going to create, you've created overall happiness. You have saved precious resources of the court system. You've ensured that a serial killer is not going to be on the loose and is not going to kill somebody else. And so you've created overall greater happiness. But most of us say, don't do that. That's not the way we operate in this country. So we get rule utilitarianism, which says that we look for commonalities in situations and we develop rules that maybe in the instance, the specific instance, don't produce the overall greatest happiness, but in the aggregate will produce the overall greatest happiness. So the police officer doesn't go ahead and take the law into his own hands and kill the serial killer. If we take the aggregate view of this, if we had a world, what happens in Judge Dredd? What happens in that movie? Anybody know? People are terrified of the police. So overall, although you're getting rid of dangerous criminals, you're not necessarily producing the overall greatest happiness because people are naturally suspicious of the police. And it leads to overall bad results in the aggregate. So what we'll do is we'll take, based on the realm of human existence and experience, we'll form rules. Things like trials are slow, but we believe that you are innocent in this country until proven guilty. And that's not efficient. There's nothing efficient about that. But we believe it's the best system that it produces because people believe that they're fundamentally treated fairly. That they have a fair shot. That they're not going to be taken off to prison and disappeared the way they do in Mother Russia. Right? So we form rules. And what would those rules be with regard to things like integrated marketing communication? Well, we talked about one. The United States is one of only 2 nations that allows direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products. Other countries say, look, by and large, this is a rule that it leads to bad results. If people begin self-prescribing, you go to the doctor, and that's not the way medicine should work. And so they don't allow that. So we form rules. And even in the United States, although we have the most liberal consumer advertising rules, we do say there are things that are beyond the First Amendment's protection of free speech. You cannot out and out lie in your advertising. You can't say absolute 100% money back guaranteed unless you're going to give a money back guarantee if the product doesn't work. It's the reason why advertising doesn't say, so we watched the advertisement last time for fibromyalgia where they say, Lyrica is believed to calm these nerves. Not, it absolutely works, but it's believed to cure these problems. In the aggregate, it seems to work on people who have fibromyalgia, right? But you just can't say it's 100% guaranteed it'll work for everybody. Why is that? You and I are 98% similar genetically. But in that 2% of variance, there's a whole lot of things that can go on. And so I could take a drug and have a positive reaction and it will help my fibromyalgia if I had fibromyalgia. And you could take it and you could die based on that variance. Which is why they have to put all those things, may cause dizziness, may cause sudden infant death syndrome. These things sound bad, but listen to the warnings because there's a whole lot of variance that can occur in those 2%.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So with utilitarianism, what about sweatshops? So like, say in a country where they make 5 cents a day working on the farm from sun up to sundown, or they go to a sweatshop and work for $1 a day working 6 to 7. Would that be the same thing that you were talking about, or would that be the greater good because they can go to a sweatshop and make more and more work?
Economists who like the idea of the maximization of utility will tell you that developmentally, that those nations are better off as a result of the sweatshop. We went through that ourselves, that you have to go through. You don't just like Venus spring from the foam and become a post-industrial society, that it takes time. And so that, yes, they are overall better off. So they start out working for 5 cents a day in the fields, picking cocoa beans, which these are actually, if you've ever seen the cocoa bean, it's actually kind of a big thing. It's not small, it's not like coffee, right? It's not like a coffee plant. So they would say, overall they're better off because what will happen is, and this is happening in places like sub-Saharan Africa, there are now companies that are going in and doing microloans. and there are these people that are becoming little entrepreneurs. And that's so you start out working in the field and you build up enough money that then you start selling oranges yourself. And you start a little business, right? And then you go to work for the factory, and that's not great, but maybe the next generation will be better. And that's what happened in the United States, right? We had families that went to work in the textile mills, and you know, if you lost your finger or your hand in the textile mill that day, they paid you that day's wages, and that was it. That led to the organization of labor and the collective bargaining. I mean, this was an incremental process. And so developmentalists and political economists, particularly, who study the developing world, will say, look, these are the steps that you have to go. And it's not pretty, but there's a lot of life that's not pretty. Right? Now, most of us who are ethicists say, the fact that we did it can't be used as a justification. It was wrong when we did that. Slave labor was wrong in the United States when we did it. And
It's not the only way to do it.
right, yeah, it's not, and it's not the way that we should engage. So you can have this ends justifies the means, and there are just some things that we say are just, even in rule utilitarianism attempts to cure these things, but there, you could come up with rules, again, where it would be the ends justifying the means, and there are just some things that we say, that's creepy. Don't do it. We allow, as part of the rules, for the evaluation, one of the things you can do, okay, there are a couple of things, like forever and ever and ever, the Vista used to do this survey of freshmen, and they asked freshmen at UCO where they thought they would be when they were 30, and overwhelmingly, those freshmen would say, I'm going to be a millionaire by the time I'm 30. I said the same thing, by the way, when I was a freshman, and we see how that turned out poorly. Okay? So probably not going to happen for you. But we say these things, and we could come up with products that assess these kinds of risks and valuations. If you want to get a good job, I can guarantee you that if you want a chance at making 6 figures your first year, get a job in sales. The other one, there are two degree programs we both offer here at UCO that I can guarantee you have a pretty good shot of making a 6-figure salary your first year out. One is sales, the other is actuarial science. Now it's creepy. Now you have to be really good at math and good at statistics, but actuaries will tell you things like, I am worth more than you. I am. Why is that? I have a JD and a PhD and I make a lot of money. You know, for coming down here 2 days a week. It's good work. You want to make $160,000 a year? Get a PhD in marketing. That's the average starting salary this year for PhDs in marketing. So, you know, right now I make more money than you. You get a sales degree and you go to work for Gartner, which I understand you're not going to go to work for Gartner. You go to work for Gartner and you're probably going to make more money than I am eventually. And actuaries will tell you that you will be at that point in time worth more than me. That's just kind of creepy, isn't it? To put a value on a human life, it's just sort of creepy.
Kind of where we live in though, with followers and likes.
But we do. We do that, right? But there are those of us who say, don't do that. That's just not something that we should do. So that is one of the problems with utilitarianism. As a result, the antithesis of utilitarianism, not antithesis. I had a teacher in high school who kept talking about the antithesis, and I'm like, no, Lowry, it's antithesis. He also told us the Spanish Armada was the largest ship to sail the 7 seas.
Mayflower.
I mean, just crazy things that he said.
Wait, what figure on water?
The Spanish Armada was according to him, the Spanish Armada was the largest. He was wrong. I was like, no, Lowry, the Spanish Armada was a fleet of ships. It was destroyed in what was called the Protestant wind off the coast. You know, he also told us that Frenchy Huguenot was this guy who settled in Canada. No, I think you mean French Huguenots. It's a group of people. Lowry. It's the reason that I think high school students learn to hate history is because they have people like Lowry, Coach Lowry, for, you know, wonderful football coach, horrible horrible history teacher.
Well, mine was an avid Alex Jones supporter, so that was.
Oh, the gay frogs?
No, yeah, like this was like right around when Sandy Hook happened.
Oh,
and, yeah.
And he believed that
He-
Sandy Hook was
He
a
believed
made
that
up
was
deal.
staged. He believed that the landing on the moon was staged. And he's like,
And the 9/11 was staged.
yeah. Oh, I don't know about the 9/11.
It was an inside job, not staged.
Oh, it was an
Yeah.
inside job.
Yeah, you probably
right.
JFK was the same.
So
Well, he's also
the antithesis of utilitarianism, or the opposite in terms of a Hegelian dialectic, would be deontological ethics or duty ethics. And again, there are two types here, just like there are two types of utilitarianism. There are two types. One, and the oldest form, is religious absolutism. Now, what do you do if you're a religious absolutist? And why is this a problem? Well, why is it a valid theory? Again, you have a rule. You can go to the rule book, you look at the rules, and you can apply the rules to everybody, and it doesn't allow for any exceptionalism. What's the problem with religious absolutism? Well, the problem is going to be, whose book are we going to look at? In the United States, well, I guess we would look at what? The Bible, right? The problem with that is that are all the Bibles the same? Is there a difference between the Protestant Bible and the Catholic Bible?
Yeah, Catholic has more books.
Yeah, there's differences between the Catholic Bible and and there are differences even within the Protestant religion on the Bible, right? There's the King James version of the Bible. There's the New International Version, which attempts to put the Bible into modern day English, which is a horrific idea. You know, it should be avoided at all cost. It's the one that they use out at places like Life Cult,
I think it's like,
where,
I think.
you know, the pastors have about a thimbleful of theological knowledge,
Don't they have their
which they
Bible
should
now?
not be sharing with anybody, in my opinion. Right? But that's just my opinion. The problem is we're going to have a problem with discerning whose book it's going to be. If you go someplace else, you know, if you go to Israel, it's going to be the Old Testament. And this is going to be problematic. If you go to Utah, they have a whole other book. Right? There's the Book of Mormon. And so it's a additional testimony that they say is a writings of Jesus Christ. So we can't really rely on religious absolutism. So Kant comes up with what's called rational absolutism. Immanuel Kant, his three greatest works, A Critique of Practical Reason, A Critique of Pure Reason, and The Metaphysics of Morals, gives us the foundations for rational absolutism. Now, Kant says there are two types of imperatives. There are hypothetical imperatives, which may or may not have moral import. What's a hypothetical imperative? Why are you sitting here on a Tuesday morning, almost afternoon, listening to me drown on about Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and Immanuel Kant, when you would rather be sipping a latte at Starbucks, posting to your Instagram, connecting with your friends via text, doing anything other than listening? I mean, this stuff is hard. This is really, really hard stuff to think about. It hurts your head to think about this. Why is it that you're here and why are you listening? Well, because you know that by and large, on the whole, in the aggregate, people with a college degree make more money than those that don't. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. If you go over again, not to the land of hippy-dippy, but the land of really hippy, like extreme hippy-dippy, which is called the College of Fine Arts and Design, you can get you a degree in musical theater, and they will teach you how to sing and dance and flop around on a stage. And you'll have a grand old time, and you're going to go broke. If you think you're going to be the next Megan Mullally or whoever else came from Oklahoma and is famous, Reba McEntire, Garth Brooks, I'm going to disabuse you. You're not, no. You may have been the best little high school musical star in Clinton or Gotebo or wherever it is you crawled out from under and threw down the plow and came to the big school, you know, saw the bright lights of the big city. But you're probably not going to make it. I mean, the odds are just not very good. Now, the odds are really good if you get a degree in sales, that you're going to get a good job. Really good odds. Flopping around, not so good. What?
You also have to be good at sales. Not everybody can be a salesperson.
I disagree.
I think you can learn how to be a salesperson.
You can be taught.
Everyone's a
I feel like
salesperson.
You can be
need
taught.
to have that talent.
You can, but there's definitely a process that you can go through.
But we're
and you
all
can be
salespeople.
Is
better.
it as high stress as they say it is?
Is it
My
more
uncle
for
works for
the-
Verizon in Northern California, and they're
No, but
business to business.
I think
It
that's,
didn't stress me out at all.
it
Oh,
depends.
it's fun.
I mean, I think if you believe in the product, you know,
You can,
and
you
you,
can crack the odds.
Are your
if
quotas
you're not good at
amazing?
sales, you go get you a degree in actuarial science. You can sit in a darkened office with a formula and you can make lots of money, okay? I mean, get a degree in accounting, they make lots of money too.
I've tried it.
You tried accounting?
Don't
No. I mean, the accountants generally make decent livings, and so, you know, I mean, your odds are better if you do these things. Your odds are better of getting a good job. That's why you're here. So hypothetical imperatives would say things like, if you want a chance of getting a good job, and it used to be that I could guarantee you that if you went to college, you would achieve middle class status, for the most part. When my mother went to college, everybody who went to college pretty much achieved solidly middle class status. That's no longer true. And there are a lot of students now that I talk to, you know, that are high school age and younger who say, I'm not sure that college is worth it. And I can guarantee you that you may not achieve middle class status if you go to college. But if you don't go to college, your odds are greatly reduced. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't do something, but you're going to have some post-high school education. You can go into HVAC and you can make a lot of money. You could go into plumbing and you could make a lot of money. Electricians make a lot of money. And so, you know, but it's going to require something beyond just high school to do that. You're going to have to develop some solid skills. And so I think that that's really important. But college is still probably the best way to crack and have a really good shot at making a lot of money. Yeah, the other.
Oh, I was just gonna say, my roommate, he's an electrician, and he does really damn good. And he's just an apprentice right now.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not even graduated or anything like that, and he's still bringing home probably about $45,000 a year.
That's like starting out for a
That-
marketing major.
Plumbers will make more money than that. I can guarantee you. There's a joke. The neurosurgeon's toilet is exploding and blowing up, and so he calls the plumber, and the plumber goes in and he pounds on some pipes for a few minutes, comes out 5 minutes later and hands the neurosurgeon a bill for $500. And the neurosurgeon says, I'm a neurosurgeon and I don't make $500 for 5 minutes worth of work. And the plumber looks at him and said, neither did I when I was a neurosurgeon. So, I mean, there are things that you can do, but you're going to have a skill. And for most of you, you probably, I mean, you can make a lot of money. I could probably make a lot of money as a plumber. I don't want to do that, right? I like my suit and tie. I like being in an air-conditioned building and not crawling around, you know, under houses and things like that. But I can tell you, I own 3 large old homes in Guthrie, and my plumber makes a lot of money off of me. I've got 16 bathrooms, and you know, I can tell you he makes a lot of money. I don't want to do it. So hypothetical imperatives exist because there's some want. You want to. I wanted. After I went into industry, I realized that this was hard work. I didn't want to work that hard. So what could I do that doesn't require working that hard and still makes a good living? Well, it's called marketing professor. So I toddled off to New Mexico State and got me a PhD and came back and became a marketing professor. That's a hypothetical imperative. It doesn't have a lot of moral import to it. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, do have moral import. deontological ethics denies the importance of results. Duties from a categorical standpoint are discerned a priori with the mind's eye. Well, how do you do this? Well, Kant says what you have to do is you have to develop rules that are based on reason, that are logically consistent and universally applicable. What is that? Well, what is the categorical imperative? You can't have a couple of glasses of wine and begin to recite the categorical imperative and not begin to sort of smile a little bit and see how difficult this is. Well, what's a categorical imperative for Kant? Always treat another rational being as an end in and of themselves, never as a means to an end.
Treat others as you would want to be treated.
No.
I was lost.
No.
Yeah,
That's not going
I
to
was trying to
work.
write it down.
That's not going to work for Kant. The golden rule is not going to work. And why is the golden rule? I may want things done to me that you don't want done to you. Right? Or vice versa. No. You have to always treat people as an end in and of themselves. Well, what does that mean? Never lie. Never lie. Kant says you can't lie. Why? Because when you lie, you are manipulating somebody else and you are treating them as a means to an end to get what you want. Now, why do I say you can't have a glass of wine and start to recite this and not have a... Never lie? Never lie? How many of you have an insignificant other?
Oh, wait, what?
An insignificant other?
I don't.
You know, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a fiancé, that's Oklahoman for fiance. I have a whole Oklahoma English dictionary. How many of you have this? Some of you are socially inept, not capable of human contact. Well, okay. Never lie. How does this look on me? Well, it's the reason I'm divorced, I can tell you. Because I say things like, you look like death in pastels. Go back upstairs and change. That outfit is awful. Never lie. Kant would say no. Why is it? Because when you lie, why is it that we do that with our insignificant others? We say, oh, you look fine. You try to retreat to what you think is safe ground. You look fine. And everyone knows that FINE stands for freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. Fine. But Kant would say, don't lie. Because, you know, your partner, your life mate, whatever you want to call them, you know, is going to go out and somebody's going to say, oh my God, did you see that hideous thing that she looks like death in pastels?
I tried it though.
Right? You know? So never lie. Well, yeah, that's sort of a funny example, but let's think of a more serious example, the hypothetical of the inquiring murderer. You live next door to Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mr. Smith is an alcoholic. He frequently beats his wife. He has told her that if she leaves, this is Sleeping with the Enemy. How many of you have seen that Julia Roberts film? Rather old film now. Says, if you leave me, I'll kill you. You see Mrs. Smith leaving one day, and she says, I'm going to the shelter for battered women. Please don't tell Mr. Smith where I've gone. Mr. Smith comes home 30 minutes later, knock on the door. Have you seen Mrs. Smith? I believe she's gone to the shelter for battered women. I think she's left me. I need to find her. Never lie. Kant would say that, you know, results don't matter. Yep, that's where she went. Well, most of us would say no, right? No. No, she didn't go. She went to her mother's house, and then you call the shelter. He's on to you. You better leave, right? But Kant would say results don't matter. For most of us, we recognize that the rules are important, but that there are some things where you just say that's too harsh. We're not gonna do that. So ultimately, I think if you ask Kant why it is that you could never lie, it's because he would say, if you've seen a movie, there's a movie called with Ricky Gervais. How many of you like Ricky Gervais? I can't stand Ricky Gervais, but he was in this movie called The Invention of Lying. Everybody is brutally honest in this film, in this world that he lives in. Everybody's brutal honesty. And he's the first person to lie. And he realizes that by lying he gets things. Like he goes to the bank, he's out of money, and he tells them that it's their mistake, and they just need to, there's $1 million in his account. And they, okay, and they just give him $1 million. And that's all right for a while, but then it starts to spin out of control. I think that's what Kant would say, is that if we relied on lying, you couldn't ultimately form a society. And isn't that really a backdoor way of saying that results do matter? That they do matter. So I think it's ultimately premised on the idea that results do matter. Now, of course, we should be very cautious, and I say this as we think about integrated marketing communication, and we think about advertising, and we think about personal selling. We should be honest to the extent humanly possible. Now, we can't know everything. There are lots of side effects, for example, with drugs, that we may not know what the side effect is. But to the extent possible, that's one of the reasons we say things like you have to say, may cause indigestion, may cause heart attack, may cause your head to fall off in the advertisements for things like pharmaceutical drugs. Well, what's the third one? A holistic approach to ethics is the Aristotelian approach. And it goes back to two books that Aristotle, the foundations of this, are the Nicomachean Ethics, named after his son Nicodemus, and the Eudamian Ethics, which I believe was named after the student, the archivist, who sort of put them together. Most philosophers believe the Eudamian Ethics is the older and less complete work, and the Nicomachean Ethics is the more complete and later work, although Sir Anthony Kenny at Oxford believes that actually the Nicomachean Ethics is first and Eudamian Ethics, and I would certainly hate to disagree with Anthony Kenny on anything Aristotle, and I believe that Daniel Robinson, Professor Daniel Robinson, also believes that. Well, what do we get in these works? Well, Aristotle, again, is a scientist, and so he studies. So in Republic, we get the ideal form of society. And Socrates says this society is the best society for all places, all people at all times. Aristotle doesn't view it that way. Aristotle says, well, there are good governments and bad governments, for example, and there are good governments and bad governments of one, a few, and many. So you can create this chart. Good, bad on the vertical axes, and one, few, many on the horizontal axes. A good government of one he calls a monarchy. A bad government of one he calls a tyranny. A good government of a few he calls an aristocracy. And by good, he defines these terms as a good government is one that governs in the interest of the governed. A bad government is one that governs in the interest of the leader or the rulers. So a bad government of a few is called an oligarchy. A good government of many is called a polity. And the worst form of government overall is democracy, which is mob rule. Why do I tell you this? Well, what we see throughout Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudamian Ethics on Aristotle's politics and Aristotle's friendship is this idea of balance and proportionality. Aristotle says, and I think this is one that we really should think about as marketers, Aristotle says, for example, there are 3 types of friendships. There are friendships that are grounded in utility. These are the friends that you have at work. How many of you have had a job? Almost everyone in here should raise their hands. Did you make friends at work? Ms. Reyes is socially inept. You said no.
I said,
And,
I mean, like, I'll talk to them at work, but do I want to hang out with them outside?
but you're friendly.
Oh, yeah, I'm friendly. I like
You don't spit at them like a llama, right? I mean, you say hello,
Yeah.
good day. And when you leave that job, you're not going to say hello to them anymore or talk to them, and the friendship will end, right? That happens. These are transitory. Nothing wrong with that. Aristotle is not priggish about this. He just says that you have to recognize that as long as the utility is there, the friendship will continue, and the utility is not there, it will end. There are friendships grounded in pleasure. A befriends B because you like to drink together. And when you go to whiskey school, otherwise known as the Betty, when they dry you out, they're going to tell you you have to switch your playgrounds and your playmates. Right? Why are you going to have, so you're not going to be able to go hang out with the person that you went to the bar with. Why? Because you're drying out. So the friendship will end. Then there's friendship that's founded on perfection, or the ideal form of friendships. These are the friends of the lifetime. They're the ones that you can count on a hand. They will be there. They are your friends not because they're useful or you're useful to them, although that may be the case, but that's not the foundations of the friendship. Or because you have pleasure, that may be the case as well, but that's not the foundations of it. You befriend somebody. Smith befriends Jones because Smith wants what is best for Jones. Now, why do I think this is useful for us as marketers? Well, I think we should recognize that there's an age-old maxim that says, don't mix business with friendship, or don't mix business with pleasure. That's not really true. We should recognize that in an era in which we have gone beyond transactional selling, in an era in which we engage in relationship selling, that we should build relationships because customers have a lifetime value. We can take Aristotle and we can recognize that we can build on these ideas. And it's this idea of balance and proportionality. So Aristotle doesn't tell us how we should act in any given situation. He doesn't tell us what the rules are. Virtue ethics is a holistic approach, and it's one that I think we should seriously consider as marketers and as business people. Because it's not going to say, don't do this. Lots of business ethicists will tell you, and they're wrong, absolutely wrong on this. Because a lot of my colleagues who are business ethicists don't have the grounding in philosophy that I do. They'll say things like, the law is an acceptable moral minimum for business people to operate with. Wrong. A priori wrong. Why is that? The law itself may be immoral. We had laws in this country in places like Oklahoma, and it wasn't that long ago. My best friend, who is the chief legal counsel here at UCO, went to segregated schools. He's 61 years old. I realize that you all think that that's 1 foot in the grave and almost dead. But that was not that long ago that we had segregated schools in this state. You could not go and eat at a lunch counter if you were a person of hue in Oklahoma. That law, that was the law. And that law was immoral. So it's not acceptable to say that the law is an acceptable moral basis. The law is an important consideration, but it is not the foundation for ethics. And I think virtue ethics provides us with a really very nice foundation because it is based on this idea of balance and proportionality. So rather than saying do this or don't do that, Aristotle looks at the holistic individual. How do we make a good person? What makes a good and ethical salesperson? What makes a good and ethical marketer? How do we achieve that? Well, it's by looking at the extremes of human behavior, the defects, and finding the middle ground. What's an extreme defect of character? Cowardice. Cowardice is an extreme defect of character. What's the opposite of cowardice? It's not courage. It's heedlessness. The coward backs away from every fight. And as you think about this in business, you will have to challenge your bosses as you go out into business. If you are mealy-mouthed and you back away because your boss tells you to do something, when I was at the American Education Corporation, my boss, I went to him and I said, Jeff, we were doing an RFP for a school district, and the numbers weren't adding up. And I said, these numbers are wrong. We don't have these titles. And he used an expletive that begins with F and said, F those numbers, live on the edge. And I said, no, I'm a lawyer. I have to sign this RFP that we're providing truthful and accurate information to the school board. And no, I'm not going to do that. Knowing full well that he could have said, you're fired. I'll find some lawyer who will. You know, the coward would say, oh, no, yes, sir. What's the opposite of that? The heedless person is the one who charges into every battle, willing to die for every cause, the slightest insult, and they're willing to go to war. The slightest provocation, no, that's not good either. What's the middle ground? Courage. The courageous person knows when it's futile to fight. Sometimes you have to retreat in order to live to fight another day. But they don't always retreat. They know. What else could we say? Well, we do this for a whole list of things. Benjamin Franklin, one of the criticisms of virtue ethics is that they say, well, even if we could agree on what the virtues are, can they be taught? How do we determine what the virtue should be for a human being? That's one of the criticisms. I think Aristotle gives us a pretty good idea here on how we determine the end of a human being. The way we determine the virtues is we say, what is the purpose of a human being? We have to arrive at what's called the terminus ad quem, the point at which it no longer makes sense to ask why. What does Aristotle say the terminus ad quem of a human being is? Well, he says it's this ancient Greek word called eudaimonia, U-D-I-A-M-O-N-I-A. U-D-I-A, and I hate these rooms. I love chalkboards because, see, I could have written this on the chalkboard in the olden days. U-D-I-A-M-O-N-I-A. How is this usually translated? Well, it's usually translated as the end of a human being is the eudaimonic life is happiness. I think that's wrong. Sir Anthony Kennedy thinks that's wrong, and Daniel Robinson thinks that's wrong. They say that the better translation of that word is a flourishing life, because we cannot possibly mean happiness as in drink up, let's have another round. It's the flourishing life. The flourishing life is one of balance and proportionality. And I think Aristotle does a good job in making that argument, that it's the eudaimonic life. Next criticism is, even if we can agree that that's the end of a human life, how do we determine the virtues? I think Aristotle gives us a good formulation. It's the means between extremes. And then, even if we can agree above items, how do we instill these virtues? Is it capable? Well, I would go back to Socrates, and the argument, it's not whether it's possible. You don't need a philosopher to tell you what's possible. You need the philosopher to tell you what the best in you can be. And there's at least one example that we know worked. Benjamin Franklin noticed at a young age that he had certain leadership skills. He came from a poor family, by the way. He is one of our favorite founding fathers. He's the only founding father, by the way, that we know by his nickname. No one says Tom Jefferson, but we know Franklin by his nickname, Ben. He came from very humble beginnings and rose to be a man of extreme importance. He was a prolific inventor. He invented all kinds of things that he didn't take out patents on. He wanted them to be in the public domain. What kinds of things? As a result of his experiments with lightning, he developed the lightning rod. He invented the Franklin stove, which is a wonderfully efficient way of heating. It's the forerunner for the modern wood-burning stove. How many of you have had a wood-burning stove? They're wonderful.
He also invented the library.
They're very efficient. He invented bifocals. Yeah, he invented all these things. He rose, and he didn't start out that way. He was sort of a leader of boys, but he got them into scrapes, and he was famous for making up puns, and he noticed that people didn't like them. So he came up with his own virtues. He came up with 13. Why are there 13? The same reason that historically there were 13 episodes in a sitcom. You could get through 4 complete cycles in a year, because if you multiply 13 by 4, you get, 52. And how many weeks are there in a year? 52. So he came up with 13 virtues. He put them down on a little piece of ivory. And if he had what were called dots, he knew there was more work to do that day. So what are his virtues? They're based on Aristotle's idea of this balance and proportionality. Temperance, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Silence, speak but what may benefit others or yourself, avoiding trifling conversation. Order, let all things have their place, let each part of your business have its time. Resolution, resolve to perform what you ought, perform without fail what you resolve. Frugality, make no expense, but to do good to others or yourself, waste nothing. Industry, lose no time, be employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. Sincerity, use no hurtful deceit. Now you see, this is where we differ from Kant. Kant would say, don't ever lie. But the virtuous person knows, use no hurtful deceit, think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly. Don't deliberately hurt somebody's feelings. You can say you would look better in something else rather than using brutal honesty, right? Justice, wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty to others. Moderation, avoid extremes, forbear resulting injuries as much as you think they deserve. Cleanliness, tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habituation. Tranquility, be not disturbed by trifles. I think this is one that we should really think about in the modern world. Don't constantly be tilting at windmills. I love this one. Chastity. Rarely use venery, that's an old-fashioned word for sex, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or to the injury of yours or another's peace or reputation. Humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. I think these are good ideas. And they seem to have worked. He transformed himself. He was his own little sociological experiment. And he went from being sort of a ruffian to being one of our favorite founding fathers and statesmen. Prolific inventor, great businessman. And I think that these are well worth considering. Any questions on virtue ethics or ethics in general? Next time we'll talk about chapter 2, and I should be able to get us caught up. We're still a little bit behind. I'll try to get the video from Thursday posted along with today's video, and we'll move on to chapter 2 next time. If you didn't sign the roll, be sure and sign it.